At the beginning of 1945, the world was still at war, the final months of World War II. The Soviet Red Army was advancing through the Baltic region and other parts of Europe, committing terrible atrocities on the civilian populations in East Prussia and elsewhere. Whole towns were being massacred with no one spared. So great was the fear of the notorious Soviet brutality that the entire population of that part of the world was desperately attempting to flee for their lives, leaving everything behind and escaping by any available means to anywhere they could possibly go. Most who managed to escape did so on foot or by wagon, and in a month's time, 8.5 million frightened, desperate, starving people had fled across Europe for their lives. The situation was very much like that we have seen in our own days in other parts of the world. The faces may be different, but the fear and the feelings of fleeing people are the same. On January 30th, 1945, an old cruise ship known as the Wilhelm Gustloff started its engines for the first time in years. This time it was not embarking on a pleasure cruise as it had in peacetime. Those days were long gone. This time its mission was an act of mercy, to take as many frightened refugees as possible to safety from the butchery of the Red Army. The cruise liner was designed to hold a maximum of 1,880 people. Today, 10,500 people crowded onto it, as many times that number watched with envious eyes from the harbor. About half of those who managed to board were infants and children. It was bitter cold on the Baltic as snow and hail and wind pelted the ship. With that many people jam-packed aboard, conditions were abysmal, but no one cared. The promise of safety was all that mattered. It was a promise that was not to be fulfilled. Unbeknownst to the people on the ship, they were not alone in those waters that night. A Soviet Navy submarine was lurking below the surface. Its captain was already facing court-martial and needed to redeem his reputation by doing something big, really big. Without informing headquarters, he slipped his submarine into the Gulf of Danzig, searching for a way to make himself a hero and save his skin. Suddenly, through the snow, he found it, the silhouette of an enormous ocean liner. This sight would change his fortune forever, but it would also change the fortunes of the many thousands of shivering children and desperate refugees packed together as one large floating target. In rapid succession, 3 torpedoes pierced the ship, and the fate of the refugees is sealed. As the doomed Wilhelm Gustloff sinks, 9,500 people perish in the icy Baltic waters, making it by far the greatest maritime disaster in human history. The following day at dawn, a small patrol boat arrived at the scene of carnage, finding a sea of floating, frozen bodies. Shining the searchlight into the darkness, Petty Officer Werner Fick spotted a lifeboat. He jumped into it, looking for signs of life. Amazingly, among the frozen corpses, he discovered a tiny infant wrapped tightly in a woolen blanket, blue from cold and barely alive, but miraculously still breathing. This baby was the last survivor found. Taking the infant into his arms and into his own cabin, Officer Fick lovingly revived him. When the parents could not be found, the good officer's heart went out to the little boy, and he adopted the child himself. Thus, in a wondrous way, the same waters that had given birth to so much death and destruction now gave birth to a real love and a new life. The vast sea called life is just as capable of the darkness of death and destruction as is the sea of water. But both are equally capable of bringing out the most brilliant light and life and love. We can find ourselves overcome by the tumultuous waves of life, a watery grave in which to submerge our talents, our gifts, our dreams. We can also find in those same waves a marvelous boost to lift us higher, an infinite well connecting us to something far deeper than ourselves, sustaining us, reviving us, making us sharers in a wonderful new light, a magnificent new life. Unlike the huddled masses of refugees on the sinking ship in the Baltic, we make the choice on the sea of life. We can allow ourselves to become frozen and lifeless. We can choose to sink in a sea of despair. Or we can master the waves and the torpedoes that come our way, seize them, own them, and allow them to propel us to undreamed of heights and unfathomed depths. We have all set sail. Whether the waters will be for us waters of death or waters of life is something that we ourselves must answer. As for me, I am with the woman at the well. Give me living water that I may live, living water that I may love, living water on which to be carried into the God of love and life.